Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Daily Friend Show. I'm standing in for Nicholas Lorimer, who's taken this week as leave. And just before we get into today's show, there's a word from our sponsors. We still have to pay the bills here at the Daily Friend. So exchanges are crashing, banks on the run and being bailed out, and the money printer is running faster than ever. Bitcoin was built for this, but is worthless if it's kept on an exchange, which then collapses. Enter Bitvas, South Africa's only place to buy Bitcoin, and have sent it directly to your own self-custody. That means should Bitvas ever shut down, your Bitcoin is entirely safe, as it is fully in your control, like having gold in your own safe at home, rather than at the bank and with only a receipt to prove ownership. Bitvas offers advice on how to set up the best self-custody solution to achieve maximum security for your Bitcoin and keep it safe during tumultuous times ahead. To make accumulating Bitcoin even easier, Bitvas's SAT Stacker allows you to set up repeat purchases of Bitcoin on a weekly or monthly basis. Bitvas is the safest way to accumulate Bitcoin. Head over to bitvas.io and set up your account today, or click the link in the description to find out more about SAT Stacker. So that is our sponsor, Bitvas. So go check them out. But so today's Daily Friend Show, as I said, I'm Marius Roodt. I'm hosting in Nicholas Lorimer's stead, and I'm joined today by Gerbrandt van Heerden from Cape Town. How's it going, Gerry?
Hi, Marius. I'm surviving.
That's good.
I'm in Cape Town, so life isn't too bad.
So a couple of the stages of load shedding below us, I suppose.
Yeah.
And Chris is also here in Hattingh, or God's own country, as I like to call it. How's it, Chris?
I don't know if I support that, but yeah, good afternoon, Marius and Harry. Good to be with you guys. On that contentious note, I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so I think we're going to start today with bits of government 180, a government retreat. And this is on the announcement this morning by Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana, that the exemption that Eskom was granted because to not report on irregular and irregular expenditure and so on, that exemption has now been pulled back. And I mean, Eskom only had that exemption for, I don't know, 2 or 3 days. So yeah, Chris, let's start with you. As Nick Lorimer says, what do you make of this? Do you think, why did Eskom have this exemption in the first place? Do you think it was just the government didn't think this through? Do you think there's something a bit more sinister about it? Was it a ploy to allow even more looting at Eskom? Or do you think it was just, as I say, the government didn't think this through? And now that they've come to their senses, when there's people from all over the political spectrum and different walks of life in society said, I mean, this is completely ridiculous. So what do you think was behind this?
I think it's mostly concern with court cases. So as far as I know, there was concern from government side around a court case, firstly from Outer coming down the pipeline that they saw they were going to lose, and there would be likely other civil society organizations following a similar route. So very short term, just not wanting to deal with those implications and those costs and all that sort of stuff from losing a court case. And secondly, just a wider point in terms of how this is the latest example of government's credibility being undermined. So you already had the years of state capture, you had looting during COVID, you had mass corruption being exposed almost daily at Eskom as the prime example, especially by former CEO Andre de Ruyter. So you had that in play, and I don't see how anyone would have thought that the conditions have changed yet to avert that sort of thing. So now if you say you want to avert proper reporting on irregular spending, you still want it in your annual reports, but you don't want to deal with it in your annual financial statements. What leeway are you wanting to give to SOEs like Eskom and Transnet? Transnet was also granted an exemption in this regard. And this all forms part of the wider state of disaster around electricity that was announced, I think, 2 months ago now. That is also now coming to an end. I believe the press briefing from government will take place at 2 p.m. this afternoon, where they'll officially say this, but it's come out now in court papers and replies to Solidarity and Outer, I believe, as well, where there were court cases coming around the state of disaster, and that's also now coming to an end. So government wanting to look like they're solving these crises and implementing plans, but not thinking through the legal and legislative steps, and then realizing they're going to be in trouble with court cases and wanting to avert that. So very much a boon for civil society today, for that action by civil society organizations, by citizens who support those organizations, and think tanks who push back against these policies and these plans that fundamentally wouldn't even solve the problems that they're ostensibly aimed at solving. But in terms of the irregular spending, all that stuff, the exemptions for that, I do think it could have been justified and couched in this language of, we want to speed up the building of different forms of energy, of renewable energy. But the point is then that, for example, Eskom getting those contracts, getting that network going, they would have been exempted from having to deal with the nitty-gritty of the finances of all of that accounting. So you shift the goalposts, as it were, for these SOEs that haven't really performed as one would expect from a private sector company to perform. I don't think it's the end of this sort of thing. Don't think that government won't try in different ways to still make sure that SOEs and cadres deployed in SOEs and those wider patronage networks get the most benefit from any particular move to renewables or reform in Eskom or Transnet or anything like that. But for the time being, at least, a win there for civil society.
Gerry, do you think there was any merit to exempting Eskom from these requirements? I know that there's often money goes unspent within government departments or within provinces and so on, and partly that's because of lack of skills, and there's just not people who can actually put it into projects where the money can be spent. But often that money is also just not spent because of all the red tape to spend money in government. Actually, people might find it a bit hard to believe, but there's actually a lot of red tape to spend money on certain projects in government. I know Helen Ziller actually has said that actually getting a clean audit as a municipality is always not actually that good, because it sometimes means that money is simply often not spent. I know that the Northwest Roads Department now to give something like 400 million rand back to National Treasury because their money simply wasn't spent. So do you think there's any merit to what Eskom was trying to do? And as Chris says, maybe they could have put in different kinds of terms?
No, I don't think there's any real justification for it. I think Eskom is trying to divert attention away from itself. The issue is it just speaks to this habit of the government wanting to implement certain stuff without doing proper planning beforehand. I mean, we see that with the NHI as well. Absolutely no plans are being there's no how should I say, nothing is being properly followed according to the proper processes. And that's why the government has realized that they were going to be embarrassed at the court. And so they withdrew. And, all I'll say is that Eskom is, they're in dire straits. I mean, people are saying now that a lot of analysts are expecting now load shedding to happen every week until 2024. And, another study showed that only 30% of taxpayers will be able to effectively respond to load shedding. That's in terms of buying in inverters, in terms of buying solar panels. So that's 70% of middle-class South Africans, those earning above 10,000 Rand, that aren't able to, put contingency plans in place for when there's a total blackout, for example, which is becoming an increasingly real, it's becoming a real prospect for the country. And I think there's just no... Eskom is just not doing enough to avert the crisis. Instead, they're trying to kill transparency and divert attention away from themselves.
Yeah, I think Eskom is, because of how it's being misgoverned and so on, it's going to end up kind of like SAA, which effectively had to privatize itself. And I think we're going to see that happen with Eskom. Just, reality is going to meet our ideology at some point. And it looks like, to be fair, I think reality is winning at the moment in South Africa, but depends to, it didn't win in Zimbabwe, it didn't win in Venezuela, and there's no guarantee it's going to win in South Africa. So yeah, I think it's something to keep an eye on, but overall, I think it's, as Chris says, a win for civil society. And I think balance of forces has been a bit of a shift, I think, within the government and so on. So, but Harry, you mentioned the NHI, and I think the next story that we're going to talk about is linked to it. So there's a story in the Daily Maverick that people in the Eastern Cape at Freo Hospital in particular, people who are going for orthopedic operations, so things to do with joint replacements and so on, they are having to wait up to 10 years to have this operation. And it's partly, in this article, there's a litany of failures. The places don't have water. They don't have money for certain, prosthetics that people have to put in the joints to help the joints recover. The X-ray machines don't work. It's, if you read it, it's actually, it's one of those things where you have to laugh, otherwise you're going to cry. So yeah, Harry, what does this say about South African healthcare? And you'd think that this would make the government, shy away completely from even thinking about trying to implement something like NHI, because the government healthcare sector is collapsing, nearly as fast as our electricity and water supply. So, is this a case where reality might win over ideology? But I'm not sure in this case it will. I know that the government is still looking to implement NHI. It's still going through the gears of the legislative process. So yeah, what do you think about it? And for people who with medical aid and stuff is not such a problem, but most people in South Africa don't have medical aid. They do rely on government hospitals, and as always, people who suffer the most are poorer South Africans.
Yeah, it's funny how the government still insists to push ahead with the NHI when there's been numerous examples showing that the country simply isn't prepared to implement such a system. You've had the Office of Health and Standard Compliance, OHSC, which has recently demonstrated that the majority of South Africa's public health facilities won't be ready to be incorporated into NHI. If I remember correctly, Gauteng was the best performing province in terms of their public health establishments, and only 50% of their public hospitals and clinics would be able to meet the requirements set out by the NHI. But when you look at more rural provinces, I think 5% in the Free State and 3% in the Northern Cape, that's the proportion of their health facilities that could be incorporated into the NHI. So there's a serious problem that we have with our public facilities. And it's not necessarily because there's a lack of funds or resources. I think throwing more money at the problem isn't going to solve anything. If I remember correctly, South Africa, our health expenditure as a proportion to GDP far exceeds our emerging market peers. It's about equivalent to more advanced economies. So we are spending enough, and yet we're not getting any bang for our buck. So that kind of tells you that there's some sort of misallocation of resources, poor management of the resources that we do have, of the funds that we do have. And I think simply thinking NHI will be a cure-all by putting all resources together, pooling it all together, and have the state completely control everything. But it's completely it's misdirected, and I think what we should do is we should relieve the burden of the public health care sector by allowing the private healthcare sector to flourish and to make it more affordable to South Africans who can't afford those fees, and we can do that through tax vouchers, medical vouchers. There's other ways to improve healthcare outcomes in this country.
So I'll ask you, Chris. Harry sort of covered it, but how would you fix South African healthcare then? Do you agree with Harry, or vouchers the way to go, or are there other solutions we can think of?
Yeah, there has to be that importance of breaking up the influence of unions. I mean, the one that jumps to mind immediately is NAHAU, and the issue where you can protect those already in those positions because of the influence of the union. So if they don't perform, for example, across the board, bureaucrats, doctors, nurses, if they don't perform, they don't have to worry about competition from anywhere else, from either within the public sector or the private sector. They don't have to worry about non-performance. They get paid higher salaries regardless. And you wonder where most of that spending goes in terms of the bureaucracy. So does it go to the bureaucrats who sit in Pretoria and Bloemfontein, or to actual administrators in hospitals? I think based on maybe the outcomes, the case is the former and not the latter. So I mean, you can pool all the money you want. You can say South Africa has a sort of GDP growing at 5 to 8%. You have all the money you need to fund something like the NHI. That doesn't mean that you've then fixed the incentives and the systems in public and private healthcare to ensure better outcomes for citizens who need those. What at any point indicates that the Department of Health has upskilled capacity enough to manage something like that, to ensure that wastage and corruption doesn't happen. This isn't to say that corruption is guaranteed, but if you pool that much money and that much potential for abuse, you shouldn't be surprised if it turns out in that way. Why think that the incentives have been changed effectively up until this point to ensure that things improve? So I think the issue there of the unions, the voucher idea, I think is very, very good. But also there are reforms that could be implemented in the private sector to ensure that it performs better and that you've got more competition in terms of quality care being provided. The health market inquiry of a few years ago, that could be implemented, that the Department of Health wanted that done. It was done to much spending and using of the budget, but why not implement some of those reforms? And then the public sector focus on upgrading and maintaining at least some of those public sector hospitals that are vitally important to ensure that they deliver the sort of care for people who then can't afford private healthcare. Make sure that there's actual competition between private and public. I mean, effectively, the private sector is already funding public care. We have universal care in South Africa because that the tax money goes to public care, but it's not being measured in terms of delivering improved services for the majority of citizens, unfortunately. And even the uncertainty around NHI at this point maybe incentivizes doctors and nurses to go elsewhere. We've already got a shortage of healthcare professionals in the country. Now you're giving them another reason with this uncertainty to maybe go and work elsewhere in Africa, to go to other countries like Australia or England, where they'll be paid much more, where at least they have a sense of job security and job certainty. The discussion around NHI in and of itself as a possibility, even if it hasn't been implemented yet, is ensuring that people maybe go elsewhere. Just a last point, the Minister of Health last year indicated that the department is going to try and spend, I think it might be between 100 or 200 billion on upgrading of public sector facilities. So they want to focus on that first as part of this longer NHI process. They're not letting go of the idea of NHI, but maybe again a bit of a breakthrough with sort of pragmatism or reality sinking in, where let's at least maintain and upgrade the systems we have, the public healthcare facilities, so that they can perform better before we start doing something like establishing an NHI fund, appointing directors, having the Minister of Health in charge of all that sort of stuff. Just do some of the basics right. Don't promise to solve, all the issues of the world. And then you could see better outcomes, if that's truly what you're concerned about, delivering better outcomes for citizens.
Yeah, and I also think this isn't just a South African problem. I know there's lots of concerns about the NHS in the UK, which a lot of people seem to indicate is kind of the gold standard for universal healthcare, but there's serious problems there also with funding. I know in some parts of the UK it's basically impossible to get an appointment with a GP because you have to register with a GP first in your area, and if that GP's got already, if he's full of patients, you basically can't register with the guy. There's also other issues with, especially with dental care and so on in the UK. And a friend of mine, he actually immigrated to Australia in end of 2021. He said in his opinion, from what he could see, South African healthcare, if you're on medical aid, is better than in Australia. So yeah, I think this isn't just definitely not a South African problem, but yeah, I think the solutions that South Africa are looking for, things like NHI, which is going to create a mass. I mean, if that be implemented, it would create a massive bureaucracy worth billions of rands, and which would have very little oversight actually, which would, I think, would be a complete disaster. And yeah, it would make things like Eskom look like a picnic, I think, because people can make a plan with the electricity and so on if you have the resources. Not so easy if all the hospitals are completely destroyed. But also, I mean, at the same time, we also want to make sure everybody in South Africa has access to at least a basic level of care, which I think is something we're failing at the moment. So yeah, to move on to something that's maybe even more depressing than that.
Sorry, Marius.
Yes.
Before we get more depressing, just a last note, at the Center for Risk Analysis, we'll be publishing a new macro review on healthcare very soon. So if anyone's interested in the data on that, just so you can compare the spending and that sort of stuff and where the spending is going, you can go to the website and check that out. Thanks.
Yeah, so we are going abroad now. We're going to go to Uganda, which recently passed a very draconian law, which, as I understand it, basically makes it illegal to identify as being a member of the LGBT community. Harry, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that? And is my little summary there correct? And we also know that there's some South Africans who are protesting against the law, but we can talk about that in a bit.
Yeah, so the bill is waiting to be signed into law by Ugandan President Museveni. And it's an extremely draconian law. It not just outlaws same-sex marriage or same-sex unions or same-sex activity. It also, by merely identifying, by merely saying that you are LGBT, that could get you a prison sentence of about 10 years. They also talk about the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality, whatever that means. Also, if you are simply someone who is an ally of the community, if you work for NGO or you're a journalist that talks about these progressive issues, you could get a 5-year term prison sentence. So it really goes all the way out to destroy any sort of civil society that supports these types of issues, and really it's really going to force a lot of people underground. And it also affects an entire population, because 5 to 7% of people in the world are considered LGBT, which means that everybody in their family knows of at least one person, or don't, if they're still not out with their identity. But I mean, this has wide ramifications. I also, it's unclear for me why it necessarily is happening specifically in Uganda, because first of all, Ugandans are very conservative nation. They don't approve of homosexuality. There's been polling that has been done, so the majority of people in Uganda disapprove of LGBT people. But it's not as if the Uganda government needs the people's approval in order to remain in power or to win elections. I can't really call this an election gimmick, because I don't know much about Uganda politics, but I've looked into the type of political system that they have, and they seem quite to be like a dictatorship. The president and the ruling party doesn't really have to be concerned about what the people think on the ground in order to win their votes during elections. So I think this might also be just a way for the president to just win the love of the people, and maybe that's something that he himself believes very strongly. He even said he wants doctors to phone him to tell him that homosexuality is it's part of deviancy or a deviant behavior. So I think it's a sad day for people in Uganda, and it's also sad that South Africa, which is very progressive on this issue, is not speaking up. I think just a few weeks ago, President Museveni was in South Africa to talk about bilateral trade between the two countries, and Ramaphosa said, it was a wonderful, wonderful visit, and that's all good and well, but nothing was said about what is happening in Uganda. And I think South Africa is in that position. It's the sole country on this continent to exert influence, and it hasn't done so. So yeah, that's all I'll say on that.
So Chris, Julius Malema led a picket to the Ugandan Embassy to protest against this law. Do you think it's, he's doing it out of sense of conviction, or do you think he's doing it, just as kind of to be in the public eye? Because the EFF seems quite, in some issues, they're extremely populist, obviously, on things like, land and whatever the case. And then other issues such as immigration and this issue, issues where, I would imagine that most South Africans probably don't think what's happening in Uganda is that bad. And Julius Malema is standing up for the rights of gay people in Uganda. So what do you think's behind that?
Maybe I've been conditioned too much to think at this point the EFF's election strategy boils down to gimmicks and these once-off sort of events. For example, the national shutdown, disrupting the president's state of disaster. That's how they get into the media and get attention, and how people will talk about them. And for them, maybe that's all that is of importance. If they're in people's sort of minds, maybe they see also what some of the polling indicates, that they could get under 10% in the elections next year. So they want to be in the media and in the discussion through any means necessary. But on the other hand, I want to believe that this is because of conviction around violations of human rights, potential violations, and he wants to give his voice and his support to that. If that turns out to be the case, I'll be the first to give him credit for that. I think that's a very big boon to his character, as it were. In terms of the wider sort of discussion around this, one just worries about chipping away at individual rights. It doesn't end. It's not an end point. Now, this is not to say that this in and of itself is a grievous thing, but also then just in terms of the wider society, maybe other African countries, once you proceed down the path of, quote unquote, criminalizing lifestyle, especially a lifestyle in any regard that doesn't violate anyone else's rights. You might disagree with it morally, but are people using force or violence against you in this case? No. Once you start chipping away at that, you chip away at the wider edifice of sort of liberal, vibrant society where people can respect each other's differences. And again, the importance of, it's not just in democracy and sort of civilized society, the importance of agreeing with each other. It's where you disagree on this sort of stuff, and you're protected in that disagreement, where, in the security and safety of your private home, you're protected from those disagreements, and then you don't dissociate with each other. But if you start chipping away at that, you chip away at more than you think you might realize, and you lose that over time. And you take that sort of stuff for granted once you have these groups being scapegoated and all that sort of stuff. I think you underestimate the damage that does to society as a whole over time.
Yeah, and I think, Harry says, South Africa's still, I think, an influential voice in Africa, and we think we're very quiet on, human rights abuses across the continent, not just in Uganda. Going back to the Mbeki years, where we kept quiet about what was happening in Zimbabwe with ZANU-PF and Rob Mugabe and so on. And many other places in the continent where human rights are violated and South African government keeps quiet. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't think it surprises us anymore. But it's something that when Nelson Mandela became president, he said our foreign policy would be guided by by human rights, and unfortunately, that's not the case. But yeah, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you to everybody for listening. I'll be hosting again tomorrow, and Nick will be back on Tuesday, as Monday's holiday. But yeah, thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see everybody tomorrow.